If you take the average size of the building that currently exists along Water Street, and you use that as your module, you say, okay, I'm not going to do anything that's of a bigger scale than that because that's what's already there. And you say, okay, those pieces are going to fit in here, and we're going to make sure that no single piece, in terms of how it's expressed in its architecture, is bigger than any of the stuff that's there right now. And then you sort of connect those little things with lower pieces that connect them so that they appear as separate pieces. You start to get a logic for where you might place buildings. You also start to notice that the angle of that building is creating frontage that helps define what I call the kind of lobby to the park. And if any of you who've walked into the park, you know that area between when you leave Merrimac Street and you get to even with the back of the Firehouse Cafe, it's kind of the entrance point. People don't sit necessarily there and gather. You want to get to the open space, or you want to get to the water's edge, but it's a place in and of itself. And we thought, there's the opportunity to sort of turn Merrimac Street or some of Water Street into the park slightly and create a little place that's that balance between architecture and green space. So we'll show that in a little more detail in a minute. And this little yellow line is meant to show you how, as you would be walking along the sidewalk at Merrimac Street and you passed Firehouse Cafe, with this frontage here, you've now got something that's drawing you into what I'm calling the lobby of the Market Landing Park. Interestingly, and this is just a sidebar, right now down at that end, focused on the parking lot to the west, the only two buildings that exist are the visitor center and the attendant bathrooms, and somebody intuitively has fronted one on Merrimac Street and one on the park space. And you could say that's just where the space was, but I think there's something validating that that's a spot right there that needs something. And whoever planned this when they planned that, located it there for presumably some good reasons, or at least I'm going to use it as a justification. So if you look at it in terms of, invert it and look in terms of the green space, you see this is the green space that we currently have, and we would be proposing a green space that follows this kind of geometry. You can just see the net increase in green space, and as we tab through, the actual master plan is going to kind of appear underneath. And this is the resulting master plan. It doesn't tell you anything about what that architecture looks like. It just tells you why it's been placed where it is and how it's deferring to all of the set of constraints that we have seen in there. So this is basically the map of how we would propose the land to be disposed right now, and we're going to analyze that in particular right now. I think it's worthwhile noting that these two buildings currently sit in this conceptually in this amount of green space, and that they, as I said, there's a direct outgrowth. I was at pains to show this slide because I didn't want people who came to the last presentation, when they saw this slide, a lot of arms relaxed and shoulders unclenched when people thought, oh, maybe that's not so bad. That's not as bad as we thought it would be. And I wanted to make the direct and literal connection between those red blobs and the red blobs that we're proposing today. I grant you the one on the left is slightly bigger, and that just worked out in terms of the geometries of everything that had to be done. But the logic that existed here in the middle of June has been carried through into this argument today. So let's analyze the new plan in terms of what that's gained us. One of the things we can see, this was the extent of the original formal spaces, the edge and the centralized green space. We've preserved the buffer, the part that's not the centralized green space, as a way to set the buildings behind that. So both of these buildings are behind a separate layer of green space, and neither one of them fronts right on the center space of Market Landing Park. If we look at it in terms of just area, we have existing green space of 3.7 acres, and we have a proposed green space of 4.8 acres. If you overlay those, you can see primarily where the addition of the green space is happening right in that area where I'm claiming it's most important to put it, which is primarily out at the edge, deepening up the berm or the landscaped edge between the boardwalk and the parking. I wanted to make the point that the net increase as we've described it, recognizing that there's a little blue area that you see on the left on the upper slide, and in that area there's an area of green space which is currently sort of ill-formed and not heavily used, but we're proposing that that comes out while we add the green space where we want it to be, which is out at the water's edge, and that math results in a 30% increase. But let's look at that in detail. I would say that what's more important than the amount of green space is the location of the green space. So if you look at a section, this little red arrow is indicating as if you just cut through the current berm, the parking, the berm, the boardwalk, and the water, and you looked in that direction as if you cut a big saw right through it. You can see the water's edge on your left, you can see the boardwalk, then you can see the tree and the berm and the parking, and you get a sense of how close the parking is to the boardwalk. And then in our current plan, or in a proposed plan, let's look at the same section in the same location. And now you see, if you tab through these things, in the existing scheme, you've got that much green space relative to the boardwalk. And in the proposed scheme, you've got that much green relative to the boardwalk. And you can see, I'm sure you can see that somebody at the boardwalk experience of that parking relative to their experience of the waterfront is vastly improved by the simple issue of having more depth there and more stuff to look through. I'll also point out, I forgot to mention that we're noting the rail trail in yellow on the right on the lower section, and that rail trail has been considered as how that might connect through in this project. And there have been restrictions that the bike access not come across the boardwalk and that it come back into the site. And so we've provided for that, where you come back in across the front of the Firehouse Cafe, back down the other edge, and then down towards the Fisherman's Pier. But also look at the other connections. These now, all of the latent connections to the water have been formalized by the addition of walkways or landscape or just additional access points. But if you add into that all of the other connections that are going back and forth and accessing from the parking to Waterfront, to Market Landing Park, you start to get a grid that's much more organized, much more accessible, and much more considered than the current ad hoc way you get from the parking into the green space. All of these are now pathways, literal pedestrian pathways. One of them even goes through the center of the large building on the left. That would have an open breezeway area that takes you through. So the access and the control and the whole thought of this whole waterfront as a single entity is now vastly improved. So what does that mean in terms of the architecture? I know you're dying to see what this is going to look like, but basically it's going to look like Newburyport. I mean, we are not the kind of architects, even if we were the ones that were going to ultimately design this, that have any great interest in making a design statement that changes the face of architecture. We're interested in continuing the patterns of a community, and the process going forward would include some sort of design guideline which would make sure that whoever ultimately builds this carries, either by their own volition or by the force of law, that they continue the patterns that are found in Newburyport. And we wanted to just analyze those and let you know that those can be broken down into certain rules that can be communicated. So when you look at the architecture that comprises the downtown of Newburyport, you see a few simple things. Generally, you've got the basic issue of height. It ranges from 2 stories to 5 stories. Generally, there's a first floor that has retail on it, and that first floor is generally of a larger scale with larger glazing and sometimes a different material on the first floor. And then above that, you get a regular spacing of windows that are more scaled to either residential or to office. The buildings that we would propose to place in this location would have a similar scale. This is a section cut back and forth across Market Landing Park through the ends of the 2 buildings we would be proposing there. And what they show is that there's parking underground serving those buildings. Then there's a first floor of retail, and then there are 2 floors of residential above. Significantly, the eave line of these buildings would show up at the second floor, so it would look like a 2-story building with a 3rd story built into the roof in dormers and things like that. And you can see just by this section the relative size of those pieces of the building relative to the open front park. Where the word Waterfront Park is there, and you see the dashed line, that indicates the limits of the current grassy area in the center of Market Landing Park.